Hello, I am the Turnip of Terror, about to welcome thee to my hall. There are a ton of talking heads on the internet who could tell you all about history, be it clearly medieval history or any period of history in the past. What I've found myself specializing in is supporting the actual reenactors themselves with resources and tools, methodologies online. So today, I'm going to talk to you about what a reenactor actually is. While history is the name of the game, those who actually study history are what we'd call historians, academic professionals. Then there are people who put on historical costume and go out and do things. There's a couple different terms that are used for this: reenactment and living history. And they tend to blur together quite a bit, which is why there's kind of a murky area as to what means what. Reenactment and living history are generally thought of as a hobby, though that doesn't mean there aren't the select lucky few who actually make a profession out of it. To make sure that we all understand what we're talking about, let's go into a couple of terms. Regardless of which term you want to use, living history or reenactment, you'll find that the shorthand term for anyone who does anything in this realm, regardless of time period, is usually referred to as a reenactor. And at the end of this video, I think you'll understand why. When we talk about reenactment in the strictest sense, we are referring to the act of recreating a specific event in history. This is what we think about when we talk about the Battle of Gettysburg or any Civil War battle where you have people dressed up on one side of the battle, people dressed up on the other side of the battle. They shoot fake guns at each other. People pretend to die. We already know who the winner is. We know who the loser is. We know all of the different players in the game. That is a reenactment. The primary purpose of a reenactment is to educate, but also to entertain. Edutainment. Now, while big battles are typically what you find in reenactment because they're full of all the fun things that people like to play with, like guns and weapons and armor and war, big battles are not the only thing that are reenacted. Fun fact, reenactment has been around since forever. As long as we've had history, we have had people interested in the history of their or other cultures. In fact, there were medieval tournaments where they reenacted great Roman battles. And in Rome, in the amphitheater, they would reenact cultures of the past, which means in an Inception kind of way, you could be reenacting a Victorian who was reenacting a medieval tournament that was representing a Greek battle. Not that you should, but you could. So while reenactment is bringing a specific time, usually a battle or an event, to life, living history is more about the process of discovering the culture of a specific time and place, usually through an individual or a social class or a type of profession. A reenactment might be from one event, one day in history. A living history impression will generally represent a person or cultural time frame, usually like a 10, 15-year window, and we'll go to representing the skills and the knowledge base and the material culture, the clothes, the tools, the weapons of a specific class of person. To have the Battle of Agincourt, you need soldiers, so you need people to come and represent those soldiers in that battle. However, a living history impression of a soldier who would have partaken in the Battle of Agincourt could also represent the 10 or 15 years leading up to the battle. It can represent their social class outside of war. It can represent what they were doing before they were called up to war. It could represent their persona or their portrayal while it's on campaign, in addition to that impression's actual role in the battle itself. While a farmer would not be represented at the Battle of Agincourt itself, the living history impression of one of the soldiers at Agincourt could also represent and portray the time that that person spent as a yeoman working on his farm prior to the war. So that's a great illustration of the difference between the goals and motivations of reenactment and living history. Whereas reenactment is about making a demonstration that both educates and entertains, living history is far more concerned with education and engagement. Edugagement? On its face, that kind of sounds like only those who conduct reenactment should be called a reenactor. But it's not just interest in dressing interesting, so to speak, that draws in both people interested in living history and people interested in reenactment. It's a deep dedication to the history, and very likely you don't get someone who just does a reenactment impression without some sort of living history impression to back it up and support it. One of those major differences between living history and raw academic historical study is bringing that history to life. It's getting down and putting your hands on history so that you can try it out, feel it, put yourself in their clothes, put yourself in their activities, their habits, and create a deeper level of understanding. And by having your own personal level of understanding, you're able to bring that to the public who doesn't have the time or interest to learn as much as you do, but still are very interested in what information you have to share with them. I'll give you a personal example. Think way back to the introduction of this very video. You'll notice at the very end of it, I spoke in Middle English. About and welcome be thee to my hall. Middle English has the word English in it, but it's so different that it's not something you can understand when it's spoken aloud just because you happen to speak English. It required some study to translate, and I used a lot of resources for it, including dictionaries and conversations with people online. Also, being a dead language, it requires some rigorous study to understand its syntax, how it was pronounced, what its cadence was. Listen to this. About and welcome be ye to my hall. Notice a subtle difference? That's the introduction from one of my earlier videos. You'll notice that I used the y sound when I was pronouncing about and welcome be ye to my hall. But in this particular video, at the introduction of today, you heard me use the sound. About and welcome be thee to my hall. It's easy to make small mistakes when you're learning something new. When I had originally translated it, it hadn't really occurred to me that it is possible that I was pronouncing things wrong. Thanks to the adroit attention of the medieval community, as well as some good inferences as to the change of language over time, I learned that the medieval sort of Old English letter, which we don't use anymore, called thorn, was frequently printed on early medieval printing presses with the letter Y, which means that a contemporary medieval person reading something written would understand immediately that that Y was supposed to be a the sound. This is just one of those ways in which personally interacting with the history and trying to apply it in some practical manner generates a deeper understanding of history itself. Actually putting your hands on history is one of the more powerful tools in a reenactor's toolbox. Being able to go out and actively try things, especially ancient, unused skills or crafts, is a great way to pull yourself into the history. There's a term that we use a lot called experimental or experiential archaeology. And it's the idea of taking a hypothesis about history, about how a skill or a craft or a metallurgy or a physical activity would have happened, and then taking it out into the field and actually putting it to use, trying to find period-appropriate materials, period-appropriate tools, and coming up with the final result that we know had to have happened, but we don't necessarily know how it happened. One of the greatest examples, especially in the medieval period, of experimental archaeology is actually Château de Guédelon, which is a French castle which is being built by reenactors using only period-correct clothing, tools, equipment, resources, and technology. Everything that they're using and doing is with 13th century tools and technology. It's an amazing project. It's actually due to be done in 2023, so we've got a few more years left and they'll be done. I don't know what they're going to do for their day job after that. However, projects like this, all over the country, all over the world, from Camlin Village to Colonial Williamsburg, they create these environments where you can immerse yourself in history, both as the public coming to view it and as the reenactor yourself doing a historical impression. So by using these historical tools, dressing in historically authentic clothing, we're able to delve deep down into the nuances of historical crafts, activities, skills, and knowledge. So even if it's not at an event, but it's just in your backyard, testing a historical hypothesis, or function checking a piece of your equipment, or making sure that your whole kit and ensemble of your medieval or your colonial kit is together, you are recreating, you're doing a reenactment, even if it's just on your own, of history. One thing to keep in mind, of course, is that there's a major divide between fantasy and role-play type activities and historically authentic activities. And that last word there is really the dividing line between something like a LARP and something like living history. There's a level of academic rigor and adherence to authenticity that separates living history and reenactment from any other type of historical-esque type activity. So if you are putting your personal interests and your preconceived aesthetics and you're sidelining them and you're changing what you understand is true to accommodate the historical record, it's much more likely that you're doing living history than you are doing history-themed role play. Abandoning the fantasy, letting go of myths and misconceptions, making sure that your ensemble is entirely historically consistent, that you don't have atypical cultures that would never have commingled together. Those are the things that really define the historic part of living history and the accuracy of a reenactment. In the same way that we might all love Lord of the Rings, but the medieval look in Lord of the Rings is as historical as steampunk is accurately Victorian. What we want to do as a community is to bring the base level of understanding about our past, because our past is where we came from. Our past is incredibly important because our past is who makes up who we are, not just individually, not just my past, but the world as a whole owes it to their past to understand who they are now. And being able to have an accurate, authentic, true picture of the past is the goal of any reenactor, be it through doing reenactments or through living history. Thank you for watching. Hopefully this issue of living history, reenactment, what is a reenactor, is about as clear as mud for you now. If you have any other questions, you're welcome to ask them in the comments, send me an email, find me on theturnupofterror.com. Doop doop doop.